The room smelled of fresh ink and polished wood, a boardroom designed to impress rather than to comfort. Across the table, a dozen faces stared at the spreadsheets projected onto the glass wall. Numbers rose and fell like tides, red figures threatening to drown out the calm assurances the executives had rehearsed. At the head of the table, Richard Calloway adjusted his tie and leaned forward, his voice smooth and controlled, carrying the practiced authority of a man who had built an empire on reading people as much as on reading markets. They were on the verge of securing the biggest contract of their company's history, one that would catapult Calloway Enterprises into global recognition. Yet behind the sleek presentations and confident smiles, there was a crack in the foundation, something no one spoke of openly but everyone sensed. They had not played by the rules to get here. It had started with something small, almost invisible, a technicality tucked into the fine print of a supplier agreement. Their legal team had stretched the definition of domestic sourcing, allowing them to classify cheaper overseas parts as local. It saved them millions. When Richard first approved the loophole, he told himself it was harmless, clever, even just a way of beating the system. The world of business rewarded ingenuity, didn't it? If the rulebook had gaps, wasn't it fair game to exploit them? The success was intoxicating. Shareholders applauded. Profits soared. And once you've bent one rule without consequence, the second comes easier. Soon, their compliance department learned to look the other way when safety checks were rushed or when performance data was presented with creative rounding. Contracts were signed on promises they knew would take longer to fulfill than advertised, and employees were encouraged to interpret truth as whatever secured the deal. Richard began to think of these tactics as cheat codes, shortcuts hidden inside a game that was designed to keep most players stuck on the lower levels. Why should his company play fair if others didn't? The culture shifted quietly. Younger executives, eager to impress, took notes. They studied Richard's smirk when he sidestepped a direct question, his way of spinning a flaw into a feature, a delay into a strategy. Honesty, once praised as a cornerstone of leadership, became rebranded as naivete. To survive here, you had to bend without breaking. The company celebrated winners, not rule followers. But success bred scrutiny. A government regulator requested documents on their overseas partnerships. A journalist published a piece that hinted at irregularities in their quarterly reports. Whispers spread among employees, some excited by the daring maneuvers, others uneasy at the path they were walking. The more Richard pushed the boundaries, the more he felt the thin ice beneath him groan. Late at night, in his penthouse overlooking the city lights, he would pour himself a drink and replay the choices in his mind. He wasn't blind to the risks. He knew one headline, one audit, could unravel everything. Yet another voice lingered just as strong. Had he not given thousands of employees steady paychecks? Hadn't he expanded opportunities, created jobs, sparked innovation? If a little bending of the rules kept the machine running, wasn't it worth it? The ethical dilemma was not about whether he was cheating, it was about whether cheating in this context was wrong. Business was a battlefield, and Richard saw himself as a general. And on a battlefield, he reasoned, you didn't win by following etiquette, you won by outsmarting your opponents. Still, in rare quiet moments, he wondered whether he was outsmarting them, or simply outsmarting himself. The contract was finally secured. Cameras flashed, politicians smiled beside him, and the company's stock shot upward. Applause followed Richard everywhere, but behind the applause he could almost hear the faint ticking of a clock. He had built his empire with cheat codes, and cheat codes always came with a price. Whether that price would come in the form of scandal, collapse, or the slow erosion of trust within his own walls, he did not yet know. But as he stood before the crowd, shaking hands with leaders and investors, he felt both triumphant and trapped, a man celebrated for his genius, yet haunted by the knowledge that genius had taken the form of a carefully disguised deception. Business, he realized, was never just about winning. It was about how much of yourself you could sacrifice to win, and how much you could bend the rules before the rules bent back. Richard's triumph was loud, but his doubts whispered constantly. The more he succeeded, the more he felt a strange hollowness pressing at the edges of his pride. His life was full of noise, interviews, meetings, clinking glasses at celebratory dinners. But when he sat alone, silence pressed harder than any question asked by a shareholder. It came first in the form of people. Janet, his head of compliance, had been with him from the beginning. She was one of the few who dared to speak plainly in meetings, never wrapping her words in flattery. One afternoon, after another round of creative accounting had been approved, she lingered after everyone else left. Her voice was quiet, not confrontational, just tired. "Richard," she said, "do you ever wonder how long this lasts?" He gave his usual smile, the one that could dismiss questions without answering them. "As long as we're smart enough." But her eyes stayed on him, steady and searching. Or, "as long as no one looks too closely." That night, he thought of her words. He didn't like thinking of them, but they stuck. Then there was Thomas, a young executive he had mentored. Bright, ambitious, eager to prove himself. Thomas had started to mirror Richard's tactics a little too well. In a negotiation, he outright lied about delivery timelines to secure a contract. Richard should have been impressed. Instead, he felt a pang of unease. He was staring at a younger reflection of himself, stripped of even the thin layer of justification he used to comfort his conscience. The cracks widened when one of their products malfunctioned overseas. It was a small error, buried under layers of subcontractors and manufacturing shortcuts. The fix was simple but costly, so the company delayed, buried it under paperwork, hoping the issue would fade before regulators noticed. It might have, if not for a child injured in the accident. The story appeared in international news, a picture of a hospital bed alongside the name of his company. Richard's phone buzzed relentlessly. PR strategists, lawyers, board members, all scrambling to contain the damage. But for the first time, the cheat code failed. No clever wording could erase the image of the boy in that hospital bed. No spin could silence the angry questions shouted by reporters as he entered his car. For the first time, he felt not like a master of the game, but like a player cornered. At the next board meeting, the atmosphere was different. Not the crisp confidence of a team riding a wave of success, but the taut silence of people bracing for collapse. Some directors blamed him openly. Others avoided his eyes. Janet didn't speak at all. And yet, even now, Richard's mind twisted toward justification. He told himself this was one mistake, one fluke in an otherwise brilliant career. That accidents happened even to companies that played by the rules. That his innovations had helped millions more than they had hurt. But late at night, the whispers were louder. He remembered the first loophole, the first contract bent just enough to be profitable. He thought of the moment he had crossed the line, back when he could still tell himself it was clever instead of corrupt. He realized the truth he had been avoiding. He hadn't broken the rules because he had to. He had broken them because it was easier. The empire stood for now. The contracts still brought in billions. But Richard began to notice things he once ignored: the resignation of good employees, the nervous glances of junior staff, the absence of genuine pride in the eyes of those around him. He had taught his company how to win, yes, but he had also taught them how to cheat. The real question was no longer whether he could keep bending the rules. It was whether, when the final rule bent back and snapped, there would be anything left of the man who once believed success was enough to excuse anything. And in those moments before sleep, staring at the ceiling in his darkened penthouse, Richard wondered not how long it would last, but whether, when the end came, anyone, including himself, would believe it had been worth it. The first wave came from inside. Thomas, the eager young executive Richard had mentored, became restless. He wasn't satisfied with climbing the ladder. He wanted to leap past everyone else. And he had learned from the best. He began cutting his own corners, slipping his own cheat codes into contracts, sometimes without Richard's approval. At first, Richard admired his audacity, but admiration turned to alarm when Thomas's deals started attracting scrutiny. In a private meeting, Richard confronted him. "You don't lie about delivery times that blatantly." "It's sloppy," Richard said, his tone sharp. Thomas smirked, the same smirk Richard had perfected years ago. "Isn't that what you taught me? Winning matters. Details don't." The words stung more than Richard expected. In Thomas's mouth, they sounded crude, dangerous, stripped of the polish Richard liked to wrap around his own deceptions. He realized too late that what he had passed down wasn't wisdom but a weapon, and Thomas had no hesitation in using it. The second wave came from the outside. Regulators launched an investigation into their supply chains, spurred by the overseas accident. At first, Richard's lawyers assured him they could manage it. They always had before. But this time the investigators weren't easily distracted. They dug deeper, uncovering irregularities not only in supply records but in safety certifications, tax filings, even internal emails. The company's armor of plausible deniability was beginning to crack. And then the media caught wind. Headlines turned hostile, the kind that stuck to a company like Tar. Profits over people? The dark side of Calloway's success. Richard watched as his name, once synonymous with bold innovation, became linked with words like greed and deception. Shareholders grew nervous. Politicians who once shook his hand now kept their distance. The third wave was personal. Janet, his head of compliance, handed in her resignation. She didn't make a scene, didn't deliver a speech about morals or justice. She simply slid an envelope across his desk, her expression weary. "You could have built this company without all of it," she said softly. "You didn't need the shortcuts. That's what makes it worse." Her departure was more painful than the investigations or the headlines. She had been the quiet voice of conscience in the room, the one who never flattered him, the one who stayed even when she disagreed. Without her, the silence in his office grew heavier. The final wave came like a storm. Documents leaked, emails, contracts, memos, painted a picture of a company built not on innovation but on manipulation. The whistleblower remained anonymous, though Richard suspected Thomas, who had grown too ambitious to stay in anyone's shadow. Overnight, the narrative shifted from suspicion to proof. The empire Richard had built now stood accused in the court of public opinion, and the court of law was not far behind. As lawsuits piled up and stock prices plummeted, Richard sat once more in the boardroom where it had all begun. The polished table gleamed under the lights, but the faces around it were cold, unforgiving. He was no longer the genius who had outsmarted the game. He was the liability. Someone moved to replace him as CEO. Others argued about damage control, about restructuring, about survival. Richard didn't fight them. For the first time, he didn't have the energy to twist the rules, to bend the truth. He sat in silence, listening to the empire crumble piece by piece. That night, alone in his penthouse, he poured a drink and stood by the window. The city stretched out below him, glittering with thousands of lights. It looked the same as it had on the night of his greatest victory, yet it felt different. Every light seemed like an accusation, every billboard a reminder of what he had traded for success. He realized the cruel truth of the cheat codes he had relied on all these years. They didn't let you win. They only let you postpone losing. Richard Calloway, the man who once believed rules were made to be bent, finally understood that the game had never been about winning at all. It had been about how you played, and now the world was ready to judge the way he had chosen.